All right. Jesus said in John 10, verse 9, I am the door. Anyone who enters by me will be saved. Like I'm the way in. It's me. I love this in the Gospel of John. Because Jesus over and over and over and over just makes it really clear who he is. He defines his identity for us, and he roots it in what happens for us when we come to acknowledge who he is and give ourselves over to that. There are deep, transforming implications for us when we move in with him. This is the fourth I am statement that we've dealt with from the Gospel of John this summer. The first one, WG, our worship discipleship pastor, led us into it. And it was basically Jesus saying, I am. Like I am. And people thinking about God immediately when he said that. He said, before Abraham was, I am. This is Yahweh is. His name, the great I am, or actually, as WG helped us understand, he is because we ain't, right? The second I am statement that we saw this summer is Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. And at every one of these statements, Jesus roots that identity back in Hebrew scriptures. He borrows from what they have already known about God and then points to himself and says, what you knew about God with this, oh, I'm all of that and more. And so he says, I am the bread of life. And he points back to the manna of God, the life-sustaining gift of God when the people were in the wilderness. And the third statement is, I am the light of life. And he says that in the middle of their tabernacle feast that celebrates the light of God that guided them when they were in the wilderness. And they reminded each other and celebrated and worshiped off of that with the light lit from the menorah, the candle in the temple, but also at the Feast of Tabernacles on the first day, the illumination ceremony where they lit 75-foot menorahs in the temple courts. And it was in the temple courts when Jesus turned and he says, I am the light of life. Like when he's saying these things, the people of God are reminded of the wonder of God. And Jesus says, all of that wonder is found in me. It's the same here with I am the door. Anyone who enters by me will be saved. Jesus is pointing back to a psalm, their prayer and their worship book. And it's Psalm 118. It's actually a psalm of thanksgiving. Like the writer of this psalm is saying, he's saying God should receive all of our thanks and our praise. It starts by saying, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let Israel say, his love endures forever. Let's just say it together. 1, 2, 3. His love endures forever. Like that's the heart coming out of this because of what he does. Now why? Why is he so good? The psalmist tells us, and he makes it very personal. He says in verse 5, when I was hard pressed, I cried out to the Lord, and he brought me into a spacious place. It's interesting, right after this, in the second part of verse 9, when it says, anyone who enters me will be saved, it says that they will go in and come out and will find pasture. They will be brought to a spacious place. But listen how he continues. It says, the Lord is with me. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? The Lord is with me. He is my helper. I look in triumph on my enemies. Now listen, it is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in humans. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. When we get into this parable that Jesus is telling here, that is a key element here. Like it's better to root yourself in God and trust in Him than to trust anything of man. But let's jump in Psalm 118 to the door conversation. In verse 18 of 118, it says, the Lord chastened me severely, but He has not given me over to death. Open for me the gates of righteousness, and I will enter and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord, through which the righteous may enter. I will give thanks for you. Answer me. You have become my salvation. And Jesus says, I am the door. The same word. It's translated both ways. I am the gate. I am the gate of your salvation. I am the way for hope for you. When He said this, He was speaking directly, I think, eyeballing the Pharisee leaders. He was challenging them with His identity in a text that they would have been familiar with. You know about the gate that leads to righteousness, the gate that is your salvation. Well, that's me. Go deal with it. So what's going on in this conversation? How did we get here? And what is Jesus really talking about? This conversation started a chapter before in Luke chapter 9. So here's the deal. Jesus is doing Jesus things. He finds a blind man and he's like, we can fix that. And he does. He heals this blind man who was born blind from birth. And when the blind man gets up and goes back, his neighbors that knew him from birth, like they're astonished, they're shocked, like, how did this happen? Who did this? And the man was like, it's Jesus. Well, like, where is he? I don't know where he is. And the Pharisees, kind of the prime religious leaders of the day, they hear about this too, and they're not okay. Number one, they're not okay because this healing happened on the Sabbath, their holy day where you're not supposed to work. Well, if you healed somebody when you're working, then you must not be doing things correctly. And so they call him a sinner because of it. They call the man in and they question him and they want to know what's going on and who did this. And when they call him to the man a sinner, he's like, I don't know if he's a sinner or not. All I know is I was blind and now I can see. Like, I love the whole conversation with this blind man is amazing. His faith and his transparency in front of being challenged by the spiritual leaders. Like, he models what Jesus is trying to teach them. And so they don't find the right answer from him, so they call in the man's parents. And they ask them what's going on. And they're like, yeah, he's our son. Yes, he was born blind, but he's a grown man. You ask him. We don't know. And it says in the commentary, they said that because they were afraid about being thrown out of the Jewish church, thrown out of the synagogue. They were afraid of the Pharisees. So they bring the man back. And they ask him again, what's going on? And the man turns and he says, why are you asking me again? Do you want to be his disciples too? The response is, we're disciples of Moses. We don't know where this guy came from. And this blind man, with the boldness of faith, turns and he says, now that's remarkable. You don't know where he came from? Who has ever heard of opening the eyes of someone who was born blind? No one could do that unless he comes from God. You don't know where he comes from? And they turn it on him and they say, in their bad theology, they say, you were steeped in sin from birth. In other words, he was blind because either he sinned in his mom's womb or his parents sinned. And so that's the punishment. Jesus has conversations about that as well. How dare you lecture us? And Jesus heard about this conversation. And so he goes and he finds the man. And when he comes to him, he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? This name that Jesus grabs from the book of Daniel. And the man says, well, tell me that I may believe. And Jesus says, you've seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking to you now. And the man says, Lord, I believe. He worshiped him. In the midst of that conversation, guess who's listening? The Pharisees. Like they're following this guy around, and when Jesus finds him, and Jesus turns to this man when he expresses his faith. He says, for judgment I've come into the world so that those who are blind will see, and those who are seeing will become blind. And the Pharisees hear him. And they challenge him, and they turn, they're like, so what? Are we blind too? Because they understand what Jesus is saying. And Jesus' response is, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But because you claim to see, your guilt remains. In other words, if you came empty-handed to me, if you came looking for help, I could help you. But you think you've got it all together and you've missed me completely, and therefore you're stuck. You're in trouble. And it's in this conversation, it's immediately following this, that Jesus tells a parable that points to himself as the door. Listen to it. He says, truly, truly. In other words, please hear me. I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, well, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes before them, and his sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they did not know the voice of strangers. Jesus holds this picture of this shepherd who enters through the door to go gather his sheep. And he contrasts it with these thieves that do not enter through the door, but climb the wall. Well, take a look at this sheep pen. This is a Middle Eastern sheep pen. There's two kinds of sheep pens that you would find in this area. One would be like this. It's a private sheep pen that's fairly small, that's for one flock of sheep. They would build these pens 5 feet tall with rocks and create an opening. And the shepherd himself would sit in between the opening, and he himself would become the door, keeping the sheep in at night and keeping everything else out. And so very, very visually, they understand what he's talking about. Anybody who does not enter through the door, he doesn't belong. Let's take another look at, gives you perspective. How'd you like to build that thing? There's another kind of sheep pen that would be found, instead of out in the country with one shepherd, it would be found in the city or in a village. It would be larger, and it would contain several flocks. They'd be stored at night there. And a gatekeeper would be hired and would sit at that gate and only let the shepherds in. No one else could come in to get their sheep. In reading about this, I found some people who have been over in Israel and have seen this happen, watching shepherds come in early in the morning to grab their sheep and take them back out. And there's 4 or 5 different flocks in this pen, and the shepherd would walk in the door, let in by the gatekeeper, and start singing this little song. And the sheep, his sheep, would separate from the others because they hear his voice. They know their shepherd, and they would follow him out. The other sheep who don't recognize that, they would push away from him. And this is what Jesus is talking about. My sheep know me. They don't know you. See, the thieves are people who are entering for other purposes. The Pharisees don't understand what he's talking about. They understand the metaphor. They don't understand the application. And so Jesus makes it clear. And he often does this with his parables. He explains. You don't have to go looking many times. He explains the meaning of it. Let's look at it together. Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. Anyone who enters by me will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture." Jesus' implication for them, for the Pharisees, is I am the door, you are the thieves. I am bringing protection and comfort and care, salvation and pasture for my sheep. Your results are destruction, thievery, and death. And then he finishes with this, verse 10. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I've always heard this text, and maybe because it's been pulled out and used by itself, but I've always heard this text thinking about Satan is coming to kill, steal, and destroy. And honestly, that's true. But in this context, he's not talking about Satan. He's talking about people who have the opportunity to hurt the sheep, to offer protection and care and comfort in things that don't provide protection, care, and comfort. People who will distract the sheep and steal them away from the one source that gives hope and freedom and salvation. And his name is Jesus. That's it. This parable was told to religious leaders who were damaging the people of God and pulling them away from the one source of hope that they had. And so as we read it today, we need to ask those kinds of questions of it. And here are the questions. Number one, are we entering through the door or over the wall? The door is Jesus. The Pharisees offered protection, comfort, and care through their legalistic observance of the law, and it caused them to reject the wonder and power and authority of Jesus and actually even call him a sinner rather than coming to him through seeing his power. How about us? Jesus, in an earlier conversation with the teachers of the law in John chapter 5, says, you diligently study the scriptures because in them you think you have eternal life. These are the scriptures that point toward me, and yet you refuse to come to me. Like, this is what he's saying in this parable to them. So how about us? Let's assume the role of religious leaders today. What do we offer people for hope, for salvation? What do we offer people for protection, comfort, and care? Do we rest like the Pharisees on a well-defined theological faith system and hope that as long as we get all of that correct, we're good to go? I'm not telling you theology is not important. I'm telling you theology doesn't save, Jesus does. Do we, in our conversations, in the way that we live our lives, do we offer protection, comfort, and care through allegiance to a political party or through social engineering? Again, I'm not telling you that engagement in our world is a bad thing. What I'm telling you is it doesn't offer salvation. Jesus does. Jesus can offer salvation in the midst of communist rule and in the midst of democracy. He don't care. Do we offer protection, comfort, and care through the striving of a perfect job or a retirement plan? Do we trust in that more than Him? As representatives of the kingdom, are we making the door, Jesus, more accessible or less? Question number 2. Are we living the life Jesus came to offer? Jesus in John 10:10 says, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come to give you life, and life to the full, or life abundantly. That word actually means life way beyond what is necessary. Like it's not just that your needs are taken care of. Like He came to give you life that is in excess. Like it's Christmas Day with Him. Are we living that life? Yes, He came to save. And yes, that has to do with our eternity. But Jesus is very clearly in this conversation talking about our now as well. And there's 2 parts of our salvation that begin now. Number 1, what He is saying is He is coming to save you from the thieves and the robbers. Like that's what this conversation is about. He's coming to save you from those who would steal you away from the protection, comfort, and care that He is offering. But He's also coming to save you too. You're saved from them, but you're saved to a life that is way beyond necessary. Way beyond what is necessary. A life to the full. And I think for too long we've left that description generic. There's a really good picture in Paul's letter to the church in Galatia about life to the full. It describes this life to the full, this saved life, as life that has moved from bondage, from slavery to freedom. A life that is filled in the presence of Jesus. And the results of that life, the life to the full, He describes as the fruit of the Spirit of Jesus in your life. Like the results of living there. And I want to tell you, the first 3 are the hallmarks of the life to the full. They are the defining marks. If you have these things in your life, you have what He came to offer you. Love, joy, and peace. Love. The love of God dominated in your life. Dominating your identity. Like who He is and what we've received is what you are becoming. Number 2, joy. The celebration of freedom from slavery, from the brokenness, from the stuff of the thieves and robbers. Freedom and the hope that we have in our future. Like one of the best discipleship conversations that we can have is looking at each other and asking the question, how are you experiencing the joy of the Lord today? How are you experiencing the joy of you living in freedom in a broken, twisted, and darkened world? And peace. resting in a right relationship with God, and that nature overflowing to your relationship with other people. Peace. And one of the true things that we've got to wrap our minds around of living in the life to the full that Jesus came to offer is these things, love, joy, and peace. This life isn't attained by working harder at love, joy, and peace. This life is attained at entering the door, becoming familiar with His voice, like sitting with Jesus is where these things occur. So that's question number 3. Do we recognize His voice? Jesus paints this picture that is still going on today of a shepherd walking in the sheep pen and calling out at them or singing this song, and their sheep, his sheep, separating from the other flocks and just lining up. There's also this description that I read of a shepherd walking down a village in modern day, and cars and all kinds of things are going on, and the sheep are just lined up behind him, and he's just quietly singing his song, and they're just following his voice in the midst of the distraction. When the blind man was challenged, and the Pharisees said, "We don't know where he comes from," and the blind man says, "Well, that's remarkable." He knew where Jesus came from. He knew he came from God because he had experienced the power of God in his life. And so I ask you today, have you experienced the power of God in your life? Have you sat with Jesus enough that you recognize His voice? Let me tell you how we can do that. We can do that by being exposed to the other sheep who know His voice. And when they separate from the flock because they hear it, they can tell you, hey, over here. And they can help you. Like that's what community is about. That's what one of the two primary reasons for the church to exist is for us to help each other hear the voice of God and follow Him where He wants us to go. Like help us in our walk together. And this can happen in larger community, but it happens really well in intimate community. Like when we're in real conversations after a basketball game, we can talk about Jesus and talk about how we live. I've shared these 3 questions with you before, and I'm going to keep sharing them with you because I believe that they are questions that will guide us to this life. Not these questions. Questions underneath. They're not on the screen, but you can remember them. 3 questions that just as we go and as we live together that we can ask each other. And they're this. Number 1, what I've already given you. How are you experiencing the joy of the Lord today? How are you experiencing the joy of your freedom? Number 2, what are you hearing from Jesus today? That's a challenging question because it assumes that you're listening. It assumes that you've entered the door. It assumes that you're in the pen. It assumes that you're pursuing Him. What are you hearing from Him? And then the last question, So what are you going to do about it? Are you going to follow him to pasture? Is he becoming your shepherd? We're going to close with one song today. And I want to invite you to wrestle with those three questions in your worship. How are you experiencing the joy of the Lord? What are you hearing from Jesus? And what are you going to do about it?